When you think of power in ancient history, what comes to mind? Probably emperors on golden thrones, conquering generals on horseback, or nobles with vast estates. But for centuries, across much of East Asia, the real power rested somewhere else entirely. Not with warriors, not with nobles, but with scholars. For centuries, vast empires in China, Korea, and Vietnam were governed not by bloodline or brute force, but by education, examinations, and bureaucratic discipline. This is the story of the scholar-bureaucrats, the administrators who quietly ran empires from behind the throne. In these societies, political legitimacy wasn't just based on birth, it was based on learning. The idea was simple but radical for its time. Those who govern must first prove they understand ethics, history, law, and society. This single principle would go on to shape entire civilizations. Let's start with China, the birthplace of the examination state. Imperial China developed one of the most extensive bureaucratic systems in human history. At its core was the civil service examination system, which was refined over dynasties. These incredibly difficult exams tested candidates on Confucian, philosophy, moral reasoning, governance, principles, and classical texts. Success meant entry into the elite scholar-official class, the literati. Failure, well, it wasn't glamorous. You weren't executed or imprisoned. You simply returned home, often in quiet shame, to study for the next one. What made this system so revolutionary was its emphasis on exams over bloodline. In theory, any male, regardless of his birth, could sit for the exams. In practice, of course, wealth helped pay for the necessary years of education, but noble blood guaranteed nothing. Even an emperor's favor couldn't override the exam results. This created something incredibly rare in the pre-modern world, a system where knowledge genuinely competed with inheritance for power. Once appointed, these scholar-bureaucrats weren't warriors, they were administrators. They handled taxation, built infrastructure, wrote laws, managed education, and kept census records. In fact, Confucian ideology often viewed excessive militarism as a sign of poor governance. To them, war meant that diplomacy, morality, and proper administration had already failed. One of the most striking things about this system was how it handled failure. In many other empires, political failure meant execution. Exile often meant death. Losing the king's favor meant violence. But in East Asia, for a scholar, official failure usually meant demotion, dismissal, or a forced retirement back to civilian life. Power was bureaucratic, not personal. Your position could be taken away, but often, your life was spared. This model spread. In Korea, especially during the Joseon dynasty, the Yangban class of scholar officials followed a similar path. They passed rigorous state exams based on Confucian, ethics, and served as the primary administrators and judges. Their legitimacy came not from their swords, but from their scholarship. Even the king was expected to rule according to these principles, not his own personal whims. Vietnam also adapted the Chinese bureaucratic model to fit its own traditions. Examinations were conducted in classical Chinese, testing candidates on Confucian, philosophy, and statecraft. These Vietnamese scholar officials were crucial in resisting external domination, maintaining internal stability, and preserving their unique cultural autonomy. Once again, governance rested on a foundation of education. So why did this system work so well for so long? It professionalized governance. It reduced the arbitrary violence that plagued so many other states. And most importantly, it created continuity that went beyond individual rulers. Empires could survive bad, incompetent, or cruel emperors because the bureaucracy, the institution of the state itself, endured. Now, this wasn't a perfect meritocracy. Education was expensive, which favored the wealthy. Women were almost entirely excluded, and corruption certainly existed. But compared to a system based purely on hereditary rule, it limited unchecked power, rewarded discipline and learning, and created accountability through exams and official evaluations. The scholar-bureaucrats were expected to be moral examples. A corrupt official wasn't just incompetent, they were seen as ethically unfit to govern. This moral framing restrained power in a way that didn't always require bloodshed. This legacy still matters today. Modern states all around the world rely on civil service exams, professional administrators, and permanent bureaucracies. These ideas didn't just appear out of nowhere, they were tested and refined over centuries in Asia. So when we talk about modern bureaucracy, we are often, unknowingly, echoing these ancient governance models. In the end, who really ruled? The emperors sat on the thrones and wore the crowns. But it was the scholar-bureaucrats who wrote the laws, collected the taxes, advised the rulers, and preserved the continuity of the state from one generation to the next. They were the quiet, sturdy spine of empire. They weren't conquerors, they were the caretakers of civilization. And in many ways, they were the real rulers. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, consider subscribing for more stories from history. See you next time.